Welcome. Today we're going to talk about Java input. We've talked about printing stuff on the screen in Java, and we've talked about variables and data types. Now we got our essentially third of our building blocks, right? Output was a building block, variables and data types was a building block, and now input's the third one, so we can combine all these together and start writing some programs, making things a little more dynamic. In order for you to do input in Java, you have to use the scanner class. Scanner class lives in a library which is java.util. So scanner's not imported or included in your programs automatically. You have to actually specify that you want to use that class, and you'll do this at the top of your programs. We'll look at that in a few minutes when we get to some examples. Whenever you're going to use scanner, you have to create a scanner. You have to instantiate one. And so the new scanner system in that chunk right there makes a new scanner object that you can use. Keyboard is our identifier, our reference, our variable that we're going to use to keep track of the scanner object that we created. So whenever we want to do something with the scanner, we're going to tell Keyboard what we want it to do, and it'll make sure that the scanner actually does that for us. Here's a list of methods that exist that you can use to read in values in Java using scanner, nextInt, nextDouble, and then you've got a whole assortment of long and floats and bytes and shorts that we looked at data types the last unit where we talked about variables and data types and all the different ranges, and this just shows you that there are input methods to match up with all those types. And you also have next and next line that deal with strings, which we'll look at those later on as well. So here we have an example where we're reading in integer values. We have out.print enter an integer, that's our prompt. On this example, I have dropped capital S system just for demonstration purposes, just to save some space on my screen. There's more to it than that, but just understand anytime you see out.print and out.println that there's a system implied and it works as intended. And then we have int num equals keyboard.nextInt. The nextInt reads in the integer that was typed and puts it in the variable num. Here's an example with actual input and output in boxes so you can see what it would actually look like. On the screen, it'd say enter an integer, we'd type in 2001, and then it would print out the 2001, exactly what you see in the red output box. That's the way it would look on your screen or in your console window, depending on what IDE you're using. Just a little more of an elaboration. We talked about identifiers and variables, and now we have references, which we talked a little bit about that before too. Keyboard is the thing that's letting us keep track of the scanner. And we go to Keyboard and tell it we want to do nextInt or nextDouble. It tells the scanner to perform that action for us. Prompts tell the program or tell the user who's using the program what it is you want them to do. In this case, we want them to enter an integer, so the prompt very clearly tells them to do that. Now we looked at just a second ago reading in integers. Now we can get really sophisticated and have some real fun. We can read in doubles. And doubles differ from integers in that doubles have decimal places. And you can put an integer in a double, but you cannot put a double into an integer. If you do that, as we saw last time, you get a loss of precision error. So anyway, our prompt here says enter a double, and then num is our double data type, our variable that is storing the result of the next double method call. Same thing we're just looking at. We got a reference, an identifier, a variable name. Next double is the method that we're calling on our reference, and then that puts that value that we retrieve in the variable num. So let's go take a look at this in action so we can actually see what this looks like in code. Okay, now that we looked at some examples and we talked a little bit about scanner, let's look at this in a program so we can make some changes and adjustments to make sure that we totally understand how this works. So at the very top of the program, I have a class named Public Class Input Examples. At the very top, I have an import to import scanner. This tells Java that I want to use the scanner class in this program that I'm writing. If I don't have that import, I have problems. So I'm going to comment that line off that imports the scanner. I'm going to run it again, and now it's going to say, hey, we don't know what scanner is. What are you trying to do? You need to fix that. So I go back up, I uncomment or take the comment off, I run it again, and now I'm in business. So inside my program, inside the main method, I have scanner keyboard equals new scanner. I've instantiated a scanner object. I've passed in a parameter system in to tell it to connect to the keyboard, and I made a reference, a variable, an identifier called keyboard that keeps track of my scanner. So in my code, I have system out print enter an int -2 billion to +2 billion. That goes back to the data types that we were discussing and the ranges of those data types in the last unit where we talked about variables. So down at the bottom in my console window, I can type in 545. I hit enter, it appears on the screen just as I would expect. And then the next prompt is enter a double. So now I can type in 2.3 and it prints out 2.3. So pretty standard stuff. I've got a prompt, I've got an input, and then I'm printing out what I read in just so I can verify that it works. And if I scroll down, I also have an example in here that's commented off that goes over reading in shorts and floats. And that's not really anything that we need to deal with right now because ints and doubles are our main focus, but just some more stuff in there if you want to play around with it and get a better idea how some of this works. Now we're going to take a look at reading in multiple values rather than just reading in one value with a single prompt. So here we have a scanner that's been instantiated in Keyboard, is keeping track of that scanner. And then we have some print lines where we're reading in values. So we're reading in 3 values. So what was typed in was 75318, and we're going to read in 3 of those 5 values. And so we read in first the 7, and then we get the 5, and then we get the 3. We didn't read in the 1 and the 8, and that's okay. But we read in the first 3 of those. And here on this example, we're just reading in the first 2. And when we read in the first 2, we're going to add those up and print that result on the screen. So before we were looking at just single values one at a time. Now we're looking at multiple values that are being typed in, and we're processing some or all or however the situation may be. Here I'm reading in the values, and as I'm reading them in, I'm summing them up. So I read in the first one, I add that to sum, which is 3, and then I read in the 4, which makes it go to 7, and then I read in the 1, which makes it go to 8, and I print out the sum of those first 3 numbers. I could add 2 more sum equals sum plus keyboard.nextInt lines, and then I'd read in the 9 and the 2 and sum up all 5 values if that's what I wanted to do. Once again, whenever I create a scanner, I need to provide a reference / identifier / variable name, and then I have to instantiate a scanner object and provide a parameter that tells me what it's connecting to, what it's processing. In this case, system.in means I'm processing values from the keyboard. I could also, with Java, connect it to a file. A file could be a story, could be a group of numbers, it could be all sorts of different things, but I could connect to that, and instead of having to type in the values, I could read in values that were already typed in. So there's 2 ways you can make scanners that we know of right now. We can make one where it connects to the keyboard, and now we've got another example where it connects to a file. And in this case, everything looks exactly the same as it did in the keyboard example, except now, instead of the values being typed in as the program's running, they were typed in beforehand, and they were put in a file called it.dat. So in that file, I have 391. Whenever I create the scanner, I tell it to connect to that file, it.dat, and read those values in rather than reading in the values from the keyboard. Just another little way that you could use Scanner to give you more options. Now let's go take a look at these examples so we can get a better idea how this works. Let's take a look at an example where we're reading in multiple values at a time rather than just one prompt and one input. So here in the multi-input program, I've made a keyboard reference that's pointing at a new scanner object connected to the keyboard. It says enter 10 ints with spaces in between, so let's go ahead and do that so we can see what that looks like. I'm just going to type in 1 through 10. When I do that, I get 1, 2, 3, 9, 21. I get 1, 2, 3 because the lines 11, 12, and 13 read in the first 3 numbers typed in, which are 1, 2, and 3. And then line 15 reads in the next 2, which would be 4 and 5, sums those values up and prints 9. And then the next 3 inputs read in 6, 7, and 8. So I don't read in all of the 10 that were typed, but I do read in a good chunk of those, and it's no big deal to leave the other ones behind. If I had more input, it would pick those up later. Okay, let's take a look at another example. In this example, this shows instantiating a scanner and connecting it to something other than system.in. In this case, we're connecting it to a file. The file is called it.dat. And in that file, I have 33, 7, 11, 221, 12, and 1. So in my example, I'm just going to read in the first 3 values and sum them up. So let's run that. I get 51. 51 being the sum of 33, 7, and 11. And so in this example, I didn't have to type anything in. I've already typed in the values, saved them in the data file, it.dat, and then I connect to it and just read those in as if they were typed. Just a different way of using the scanner, and just shows a different way to instantiate the scanner with different parameters connecting it to something other than just the keyboard. So far we've looked at reading in ints and doubles. Now we're going to take it another level up and increase the fun by reading in strings. Strings, you can read in numbers and letters and symbols. You get the idea. That's what we've been working with so far. It hasn't changed. In this situation, we have a prompt that says enter a string, and then we're telling the keyboard to use the next method to read in whatever we typed in as a string. So whenever you're using the next method, just like before, you have to have a reference to a scanner, and then you have to call the method that you want to use on that reference. So here's our example. We have a prompt that says enter a string, and then on the next line, we've created a string, and then we've told keyboard to use the next method to read in that string value, and Word's going to keep track of it, and then we print out Word. So the input is I love A plus comp sci, and then it reads in only the I, because the next method does not read in white space. So the moment that you type in the space between I and love, it stops reading. So if you want to read in the whole line, you have to use a different method called next line. So in this example, we have enter a sentence, we have keyboard.nextLine. Nextline is going to read in the entire line, white space, symbols, numbers, whatever, and it's going to stop reading the moment that you type in the enter key. So in this example, we kind of redid what we had before, except we switched out the next method for next line. So it's going to read in everything. Once you hit the enter key, it's going to stop. So those are the two methods that you'd use to read in strings, next and next line. There are some issues that you can run into with reading in scanner values, and the issues stem from the fact that the only method that reads in white space is next line. So anytime you do a next line after a non-next line, there's a little bit of cleanup that you have to do in between. This is not something that you're going to see very often, but it is something that you will occasionally run into. So on the prior example, it had an issue because there was no cleanup in between. In this example, we have enter an integer, we have keyboard.nextInt. The nextInt method is going to stop reading when you hit the enter key after the number. Well, that's a problem because the next line method reads in enter keys. So it's going to pick up the enter key that's left after you've typed in your enter and hit the enter key, unless we put a line of code in between that picks up that chunk, picks up that white space. And so we got that here. So this isn't really anything you need to worry too much about. But if you run into input issues where your next line method's kind of doing some funky stuff and it appears to be working in a strange way, come back and look at these two examples, and that should help you tremendously sort some of that out. Now let's go out and look at string input, and then we'll look at this input situation in code real quick. Let's look at string input real quick. I'll go over some basics there, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about the input issues in a little separate discussion. So if you need to skip that, you got that option. So whenever you're reading in strings, as we just looked at, you got two options. You got next and next line. Next line is going to read an entire sentence, spaces, symbols. It'll stop reading whenever you hit the enter key. It'll clean the enter up, but that's where it's going to stop. The next method is just going to read in one word and stop whenever it encounters white space. So let's run this one. This one's up and running. I'm going to type in I love A plus comp sci, because as I said earlier, who doesn't? And my next line is going to read in the entire line, pick up the enter key, and then that's where it's going to stop. If I type in I love A plus comp sci one more time, with my next input only, it's just going to read in I and stop whenever it hits the space in between I and love. So pretty standard stuff. If I want to read in an entire line with spaces and symbols, I've got the option to do that with next line. If I just want to read in a single word, I can do that with next. So now let's go take another look at the input issues example. For this example, we're going to look at a situation that can occur whenever you're mixing non-next lines and next lines together. The issue that you run into is that next line picks up the enter key, where non-next lines, that's where they stop. So in this example, I have enter an integer. So if I'm running this, which it looks like, yeah, I'm running this, I can type in 55. It's going to read in the 55 and then type in a sentence like HGH, and it prints out the 55 and the HGH. This works perfectly because in between the next int and the next line, I have just a keyboard.nextLine that's going to pick up the enter that's left over after I type 55. So if I take this middle line out, things are going to get a little wonky. They're going to get a little wonky because the next line is not going to pick up a sentence. It's going to pick up the enter key left over after I type the number. So let's run this again. So now I'm going to type in 55 again, and then the program kind of goes haywire. And so this line in the middle, it's important to have. So anytime, rule of thumb, anytime you have a non-next line like a next int or a next double or a next or anything that's just supposed to read in a single value and no white space, you have to put a dummy next line in between it. And I call this picking up the trash. All right, it's picking up that trash that was left over after you typed that single value. So once again, this is not something that you need to sit around and practice for the AP exam, but if you're writing programs on your own, or if you go to a contest and you're writing programs or something like that, there's oftentimes a situation where you're going to have to do a non-next line before a next line, and you just have to understand that there's a process, a step that you have to put in place in between those to get that to work. Well, this concludes our discussion of Java input. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, it doesn't get much better than Scanner. You can read in ints and doubles and words and spaces and symbols. You know, if you really want to impress people, now that you know, a couple units back, we learned about backslashes and putting backslashes to print more backslashes, and now you can combine that with input. Sky's the limit. Well, enjoy and go out and crank some code.